Hi everyone, and welcome to EN 271, The Creative Process, the online version. Today, our text is Pierre Bourdieu's article, The Field of Cultural Production. You'll recall that was the last thing I assigned you to read when I saw you last. And one of the first things I want to address is why we're studying it. As we work up to having you write your final research paper, this article is going to be essential in giving you a language to go beyond the basics, to articulate with greater scope and confidence some of the ideas that we've been talking about since the start of the course. It's going to support some of the research that you'll be doing into the conditions of the creative process for the text that you will choose to write about for the paper. And I will say that the end of second year is a very good time to be more demanding of your own work. And one way to do that is to work with more critical theory to give you a new language and a new approach to be harder on your own work. So I'll remind you, as I've reminded you before, that we're not aiming for a kind of perfect understanding here, because I think that would take a lot more time than we have. And I think really working with critical theory is a gradual process, but we have to begin somewhere. So not aiming for perfect understanding, but some engagement with portions of the text that you can then just have just a little bit of confidence working with to support your own ideas. Because what I can see from marking the erasure assignments is that many of you have good ideas, but you're having some trouble articulating them. And that's okay because they are complex. But I want to give you the tools to get better at talking about complex ideas. And this is where working with critical theory comes in. It's not like you have to do all the inventive hard thinking. That's what the critical theorists have done. And then you need to know how to read them and quote them and re-articulate some of those hard ideas. So it's a tool, right? A tool to go in your critical toolbox. And why this article in particular, I want to address that. It's really an article that gets at the heart of everything that we've been doing in this course. The course has been focused on thinking about the creative process as something more than the kind of cultural cliche of being touched by the divine or having a flash of inspiration. Those things happen. They happen in the creative world, and I don't want to say they don't, but we're interested here in things that are more tangible, more perceivable, more available for our analysis and subject to literary and cultural context. And we've had all kinds of approaches to identifying these pieces of process as we can read them, through archival drafts of work, through varying versions of different stories, through examining editorial processes and relationships, through thinking about a text's place in a national literature or a style, and through acknowledging that every text is made via the work of many people, up to and including the reader, through considering constraint-based writing, in which the process is foregrounded as part of the text rather than being hidden within the text, and even through listening to an author, when Carrie-Anne Leung came to class, and she talked about the difference between thinking of a story as a standalone text and changing it in order to incorporate it into a whole book of linked short stories. So in short, all of what we've already done is exactly what Pierre Bourdieu would call a reconstruction of the space of possibles. That's on page 313 of the Bourdieu article that I gave you. I'm going to say that phrase again, a reconstruction of the space of possibles. What influences the text in creation, production, and in reception. So Bourdieu's article is in some ways the culmination of all these considerations. And if this goes right, I won't be telling you anything that you don't already know, but I will be giving you a new way to write about it. And also, if this goes well, you'll be able to use this article for the rest of your literary study beyond this course. Because in many ways, this article illuminates exactly what we do in literary study. We think and write about texts in context with cultural, political, and social conditions. And for those of you who are taking this course with an eye to using it towards a minor in creative writing, Well, these are even more valuable ideas for you. To know that your literary work, as you write it, will also be placed in and influenced by such conditions. These are very good things to know at the beginning of your writing career. So, I want to open up the study of the article proper by pointing to this quote from page 317 of the article. The work of art is an object which exists as such only by virtue of the collective belief which knows and acknowledges it as a work of art. Now, we've worked with this idea before, a little bit when we read Foucault's What is an Author, and we had to think about what a literary work was, and you'll all remember that example that Foucault gave. Is Nietzsche's grocery list a literary work of art? And we suggested under a number of varying conditions that it might be considered a work of art if Nietzsche's philosophy is in vogue at that time, if his work is being taught, if he's thought of as a major thinker. And if he's not being thought of as a major thinker, we don't have any Nietzsche scholars in the room, nobody knows who Nietzsche is, maybe his grocery list is not considered a work of art. So you'll note there that there's varying contexts, varying intellectual and social contexts. So that collective belief needs to be there for that work of art to exist as a work of art. So we want to break that down a little bit. And the first thing I want to think about is this idea of collective belief and how that is created, and what kind of acknowledgement is going to make a work of art exist in the way that Bourdieu is talking about. So, how do we establish that a text is worth studying, worth reading, worth recommending, or even thinking about in any way? Sometimes we take our cues from people who have expertise, so professors, teachers, librarians, film reviewers, book reviewers, even your smart friends that have really good taste, right? We take those people as our experts and we think, if they say that this is valuable, that this is a work of art, then I'm going to invest in that, I'm going to believe in it. Sometimes it's not a person so much as it is a kind of institution or a milieu. So for example, I sometimes teach a text not necessarily because I love it, but because I think it has value, because it's going to convey a set of ideas to students. So a text like that comes with an extra spin on the idea of recommendation. It comes with institutional valuation. So it's easy to see that kind of institutional valuation in a course, right? In a university course, because it's the books that are in the syllabus. We make them valuable in part through giving them attention and talking about them. But of course, this kind of valuation exists in other institutions as well, and it's almost always tied up with, what do I say things are always tied up with? Can I hear you say capitalism? Is that what you're saying? It's what I'm saying. Always tied up with capitalism. So a book is going to be promoted. Money is going to be spent on convincing you and convincing me that this book has value. It may be because it's a really current read, because it's considered a really hot read from an author that's been making it big, right? But mostly money is spent on promoting the book to us as a book that is worth reading and that we must read it and we must love it, to the point of suggesting that if we don't read it and if we don't love it, we're out of step, we're out of fashion, we're out of touch, we're uncool, all of those kinds of things. But one of the reasons why Bourdieu has written this article is that he knows that that is a kind of screen over the book as a kind of cultural product. That as long as someone else is telling us what to value and we're not thinking about why it's valued, we are going like sheep to slaughter, right? So he warns us that there's something else that we can pay attention to, something that we can be conscious of, and something that exists between what he calls celebratory effusions, praising something, sort of empty praise. This book is awesome, you gotta read it. I'm not gonna tell you why, just that it's awesome. That's a celebratory effusion. And reductive analysis, saying this is a book about a boy and his dog, and therefore it's good. a kind of analysis that is not an analysis, just a reduction of plot or reduction of subject matter. So those are two ends of that spectrum, two ends of that scale. And he says that there's a lot that's in between that doesn't get paid attention to, and he wants to draw our attention to it. He wants us to draw attention to the social conditions that support us in thinking of a book as a work of art. And he suggests that we need to move beyond thinking of the text as a fetish, and that's a term he's using here to mean like a holy or untouchable object, right? Because we're so effusive or we're so reductive about it, it becomes untouchable. But instead thinking of it as an object in the world, an object that takes a place in this field of cultural production. He wants us to take into account everything which helps to constitute that work of art as a work of art. And I am going to quote Bourdieu on page 314 when he says, "No cultural product exists by itself, that is, outside the relations of interdependence which link it to other products." Okay, so let's talk about some of those social conditions. And here's where we come to the terms that I asked you to work with for today's discussion question. And now we come to a portion of the lecture that I call Outstanding in the Field. Because, you know, puns are good. Outstanding in the field. I mentioned the last time I saw you that for visual thinkers, or those of you who like metaphor, it really is helpful to think of this field of cultural production as an actual field, right? We think of fields of study all the time, right? Fields of study involve a series of ideas, texts, experiments, analyses, interpretations, all of which exist in relation to each other. Sometimes there's a historical or a political relation, sometimes a critical one, sometimes a professional or personal one. All kinds of relationality, and you'll note that's one of the very first terms that Bourdieu points out in the first paragraph, relationality. So this field, this imaginary space, it's a wide open space described on all sides by a boundary, and it contains many objects and beings within it. Rocks, grass, bushes, trees, animals, insects, plants. And we're going to call that field literature. And we're going to remind ourselves that everything that we studied so far this term fits into that field, but only because somebody placed it there. The texts only gain acknowledgement as cultural objects via two methods, according to Bourdieu. They're engaged in a field of forces that makes space for that text to be thought of as a work of art because it's like something else that already exists in the field. Or a field of struggles that works against the field of forces and asserts that this text is radically different and necessary as a refutation of the normal and the conventional. So most texts have some combination of both, this field of forces and the field of struggles. And depending on where it's situated by these forces and struggles, the text can influence each other. They can be seen as alike in some ways and therefore legitimize each other. Or they can be seen as unalike, challenging, exerting pressures on each other in terms of what is conventional, what is radical, and what is more worthy in that kind of push-pull kind of system. So, as Bourdieu writes, the structure of this field is greatly dependent upon the distribution of capital, of specific properties that determine success and external profits such as literary prestige. And you saw in our study of Raymond Carver how that literary prestige is a kind of double-edged sword. It is something that people desire, and then sometimes that they feel controlled by that literary prestige, the confines of that literary prestige once they have it. So, but let's take Carver as a kind of example of how we're going to look at this field of forces and field of struggles. So, this will be review. Raymond Carver was influenced by his professors at the Iowa School of Rhetoric, and they taught him how to write realistic short stories in what was known as, the mid-century American style at the time. So we can think of that as part of the field of forces. Carver is being trained to write in a particular way, like others, like the creative writing professors that he had, all of whom were well-known short story writers. So that's a kind of field of forces. He's getting trained. He was influenced, according to Carver, by his children and the day-to-day need to take care of them. He literally could not be a starving artist, and he couldn't spend his time working on short stories and sending them out to magazines because he needed to earn a paycheck. And we might think of that as part of the field of struggles, the thing that made him push against a kind of conventionality. We also know that then he met Gordon Lish, who read Carver's work and encouraged him. Field of forces, good to be encouraged, right? Lish had success as an editor at Esquire magazine, and he brought Carver's work to national attention. Again, more field of forces, saying, I like this work, you will like this work, I'm going to publish it in a national magazine, and it's going to get all kinds of attention because people will recognize it as an American short story. So there's Carver gaining prominence, gaining money. He got a divorce and solved the problem of that terrible marriage. He quit drinking. He met Tess Gallagher, and so he was in a partnership with another author. All of these seem to be very good things. Field of forces, things that moved his literary career forward, even though not all of those are literary forces. Some of them are just personal things that happened in his life. And here is where it gets a little tricky. Because one of the things that we discussed when we talked about the Lish-Carver editorial relationship was whether or not Lish's editorial influence over Carter made Carver's writing better or if it made it worse. I know many of you were sympathetic to Carver, in part because Lish did seem arrogant, but it's something to think about because we can say for sure that Lish made Carver's work less conventional and in one way more influential as a new form of the American short story, as working in a new style that caught everyone's attention. Now, Lish is really open in his interview with Christian Lorenzen that he really wanted to be subversive. That was intentional. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to shake up fictional style because he thought the American short story was too conventional. He wanted to see some radicalism. He wanted to push back against what he thought was boring. And he did, and to a greater or lesser extent, it worked because it made Carver's writing grab people's attention, and it's still being taught 30 years after his death. And that's not true of every American short story writer. So we have to say in some ways that the debate over whether Lish represents the field of forces, making Carver's short stories like Lish's ideas, or a field of struggles, making Carver's short stories unlike other people's, but in both ways giving them a kind of prominence. That's an important idea. That's an important dynamic, a kind of push-pull between the field of forces and the field of struggles. I want to move on to look at another term. Pardon me, before I do that, I want to say that one of the reasons why I'm looking at Lish and Carver, because I know you know those examples, and I know that you have thought about the context a great deal, and I gave you a great deal of context in class. And that, of course, is your task for the research paper, is to go out and find more context about the other text, right? About Monroe, about Holbrook, about Nazar Hussain, if you choose to write about skywritings, or about Jordan Abel's Injun. But the term I want to move on to right now is that third term, the space of literary or artistic position takings. That's quite a mouthful. Space of literary or artistic position takings. So this kind of position taking, calling Carver's writing gritty realism, or Carver taking back control and saying, no, A Raymond Carver short story is more conventional. It is more recognizable as being closer to, say, an Alice Munro story or a John Updike story. Again, finding authors that he is alike as opposed to pushing against it, right? Those are literary and artistic position takings. They're always in relation to other texts, other authors. This position taking receives value from how it positions itself or is positioned as like or unlike other texts that people know. So, the field of forces is inherently conservative in that it conserves value. It's recognizable because it's like other things that we know. It doesn't alter our standards, but confirms them. The field of struggles is inherently radical. It asserts that change and challenge to convention is more intriguing and therefore more worthy. So I'm going to bring it back to the beginning again and say those spaces of original possibles must be constructed to create a literary history and a history of literary and creative production. And I'm going to end this piece of the lecture with a quote from page 314 in Bourdieu's article. Ignorance of everything which goes to make up the mood of the age produces a derealization of the works. Stripped of everything which attached them to the most concrete debates of their time, they are impoverished and transformed in the direction of intellectualism or an empty humanism. So, one more way of saying no cultural product exists outside of its social context, that we don't want to be someone who is ignorant of everything that goes into making up the mood of the age. When Bourdieu is talking about intellectualism, he's not talking about having good intellectual ideas. He's talking about empty intellectualism, being pretentious and saying that you know something when you really don't. He's not talking about having deep research and a deep context for texts, right? He doesn't want us to be impoverished when we think about texts. He wants us to be rich and full of ideas and full of context about how meaning is made in those texts. So that's what I have to say right now about the field of cultural production. And what you're going to do now that you've finished watching this video lecture is we're going to move into a discussion portion. So if you wish, you can watch portions of this again, because, it's the beauty of being on video. You can watch it again and again. But what I'm going to do right now is wait for you over at the discussions tab, where I will have our discussion questions posted, and I'll ask you about your prepared responses to those. And also we can broaden out the discussion. You can ask questions about what you found in the actual article, if you want me to say more about it, if you want me to give you more examples, and just generally we'll extend the discussion like we usually do, exactly as though we were in a classroom together, which really, we are. It's a virtual classroom. So I'll meet you over at the discussions tab.